In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Adolf Hitler was not in the command bunker, not pacing over maps, and not issuing orders. He was asleep. The Allied landings in Normandy had already begun when fragments of information reached German headquarters, confused reports of paratroopers, coastal bombardments, and enemy ships massing in the Channel. At first, this did not look like the decisive invasion Hitler had long feared. For months, the German High Command had been conditioned to expect deception. Allied bombing campaigns, fake radio traffic, and phantom armies had trained Berlin to hesitate. The belief that the real invasion would strike elsewhere, most likely at the Pas de Calais, was deeply embedded. This hesitation, reinforced by Hitler's personal control over strategic reserves, meant that Germany's response to D-Day unfolded slowly, cautiously, and fatally late. But even as the situation reports multiplied, something deeper was beginning to shift. Within hours, it became clear that this was not simply another British-led coastal operation, nor a limited raid like Dieppe in 1942. The scale was unprecedented. The airspace was dominated not just by Royal Air Force bombers, but by vast numbers of American aircraft operating with industrial precision. The landings themselves reflected a logistical capability Germany could not match. Thousands of landing craft, continuous naval gunfire, and airborne operations stretching far inland. What was unfolding was not merely an invasion, it was the manifestation of American wartime power on a continental scale. By midday on June 6th, German field commanders were already sensing a transformation in the character of the war. Reports from Normandy emphasized the same unsettling pattern: American units landing in depth, replacing losses quickly, and pressing forward despite confusion and casualties. This was not the brittle offensives Germany had faced earlier in the war, nor the cautious British advances of North Africa. It was a sustained, relentless push supported by overwhelming material superiority. Hitler, once awake and briefed, initially clung to the belief that Normandy was a diversion. He refused to release armored reserves without absolute certainty, fearing that the true invasion would still strike elsewhere. Yet the intelligence picture was becoming harder to ignore. The sheer number of American divisions involved, the density of air cover, and the speed with which supply routes were established pointed to a strategic reality Germany had long tried to deny. The United States was no longer a supporting ally. It had become the dominant force in the Western coalition. This realization did not arrive as a single dramatic moment, but as an accumulation of facts that contradicted years of ideological assumptions. Hitler had dismissed American society as soft, divided, and incapable of sustained war. Normandy shattered that illusion. What Germany faced in June 1944 was not merely another front. It was the full weight of American industrial warfare, now anchored on European soil. And once that foothold was secured, the balance of the war would shift irreversibly. As June 6th turned into June 7th, the German command structure began to fracture under the weight of reality. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Erwin Rommel, responsible for the defense of Western Europe, were no longer debating whether this was the main invasion, but how disastrously late Germany had responded. Rommel, absent on the morning of D-Day due to his belief that bad weather made an invasion impossible, returned to Normandy to find a front already slipping out of control. The Atlantic Wall, long touted as an impenetrable barrier, had failed within hours under concentrated naval fire and airborne landings. German coastal divisions, many understrength and composed of older soldiers or foreign conscripts, had been overwhelmed. What alarmed Rommel most was not merely the loss of ground, but the nature of the enemy advance. American forces were not pausing to consolidate in the traditional sense. Instead, they pushed supplies, vehicles, and reinforcements ashore with a speed that defied German expectations. Temporary harbors, vast stockpiles of ammunition, and an uninterrupted flow of men began to appear almost immediately. For German commanders trained in a doctrine that emphasized rapid, decisive blows, this kind of sustained logistical dominance was deeply unsettling. The battlefield was no longer defined by maneuver alone, but by production, transport, and attrition on an industrial scale. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the tone of situation briefings grew increasingly strained. The hope that a massive counterattack could still throw the Allies back into the sea lingered, but it rested on assumptions that were already collapsing. German armored divisions, held back under Hitler's direct authority, arrived piecemeal and under constant Allied air attack. American fighter bombers roamed the skies with near impunity, turning daylight movement into a deadly gamble. Roads, bridges, and rail lines were systematically destroyed, strangling Germany's ability to concentrate forces. Each delayed order, each missed opportunity, amplified the imbalance. What Hitler was now confronting was not simply a tactical failure, but a strategic mismatch. The United States could afford losses, replace equipment, and adapt its tactics rapidly. Germany could not. Every tank destroyed, every experienced officer killed, represented a loss that could not be fully replaced. As reports from Normandy accumulated, a grim pattern emerged. American formations absorbed setbacks without collapsing, learned quickly from initial mistakes, and returned to the offensive with even greater force. This was the opposite of the fragile enemy Hitler had envisioned. By the second day of the invasion, it was becoming unmistakably clear that the Western Front had transformed into an American-driven war of attrition, one in which Germany's remaining advantages in experience and doctrine were being drowned under an overwhelming tide of men, machines, and fuel. By mid-June 1944, the German leadership could no longer frame Normandy as a temporary crisis. The Allied bridgehead was not shrinking, it was expanding methodically. American forces in particular were transforming the landscape of the battlefield. What had begun as chaotic landings under heavy fire evolved into a grinding, systematic advance supported by unparalleled material resources. In the bocage country of Normandy, where hedgerows favored the defender, U.S. units adapted with striking speed. Engineers modified tanks to cut through dense earth embankments, artillery was massed with mathematical precision, and air support was integrated into ground operations on a scale Germany had never faced. This adaptability marked a decisive break from earlier Allied campaigns. German commanders had once believed that American troops would lack the discipline and resilience required for prolonged combat. Instead, they encountered formations that learned rapidly, absorbed punishment, and returned stronger. The front did not collapse dramatically, but it bent steadily under constant pressure. Each village taken, each road secured, tightened the noose around German positions and eroded any remaining hope of containing the invasion. Within Hitler's inner circle, the psychological shift was unmistakable. Briefings that once emphasized counteroffensive potential now focused on damage control. The language changed. Words like stabilization and holding actions replaced talk of decisive blows. Hitler himself oscillated between denial and rage. He blamed subordinates for failures that were, in truth, structural. Germany's war economy could no longer compete with the scale of American output, and the Luftwaffe, once a decisive instrument, was now largely absent from the skies over France. This absence had a profound effect on morale and decision-making. Without air cover, German movements were exposed, predictable, and costly. Every attempt to regroup invited destruction from above. As American divisions continued to pour into Normandy, Hitler was forced to confront an unpalatable truth. The Western Allies were no longer constrained by time. They could afford to advance slowly, trading space for certainty, because their strength increased with every passing day. For Germany, the inverse was true. Each delay weakened its position further. By late June, it was evident that the war in the West had entered a new phase, one defined not by tactical brilliance or surprise, but by an imbalance of resources so vast that strategy itself was being overridden. Normandy was no longer a battlefield of opportunity. It had become a demonstration of American dominance, and with it, the beginning of the end for Hitler's hopes of controlling the course of the war. In retrospect, the moment Hitler realized D-Day had become an American war was not a single decision or outburst, but a slow, unavoidable reckoning. It emerged from the accumulation of evidence. The skies dominated by American aircraft, the roads clogged with American vehicles, and the front lines pressured by American divisions advancing with mechanical certainty. This realization carried profound consequences. Germany's strategic options narrowed to the point of irrelevance. Resources that might have prolonged resistance were consumed faster than they could be replaced. Attempts to regain the initiative, whether through counterattacks in France or desperate gambles elsewhere, failed to alter the fundamental reality established in Normandy. The Western Front had become the decisive theater, not because of geography alone, but because it showcased a form of warfare Germany could not counter: industrialized, coordinated, and relentlessly sustained. Once American power was anchored in Western Europe, the outcome of the war was no longer in question. What remained was the timeline. D-Day did not end the war immediately, but it ended Germany's ability to shape its course. From that point forward, defeat was not a possibility. It was a process already underway,